All right, cool. Well, I apologize that we got the agenda out pretty late. Courtney and I and Clyde and Laura were all at the Colorado Forest Collaborative Summit last week, which it had been my plan all along to share a couple of like takeaways and follow-ups and ideas generated from that. I just failed to communicate that, but thank you for coming. So I thought I would just kind of go through my list of notes of things that seem potentially relevant for this committee and kind of give an overview of what was talked about. And then we can just have a little bit of discussion about if we think that these are things that maybe we should do something with, or if we want to put them in our little parking lot of ideas. Yeah, so for those who maybe don't know, the Colorado Forest Collaborative Summit is kind of the big flagship conference of the Colorado Forest Collaboratives Network, which I coordinate. And so last week we gathered about 100 people from place-based community groups and agency partners and like utility companies and all kind of the whole spectrum of people involved in collaborative forestry work across Colorado. And the theme was scaling and sustaining local impact. And so it was kind of about like, how and when is it appropriate to scale up collaborative action? How do place-based groups continue to stay relevant and productive even as state and federal initiatives are constantly changing? And then we had a leadership session at the end where we actually generated, we heard updates from agency leadership and then also generated some recommendations from the people in attendance for how agencies can better support collaboratives and how collaboratives can better engage with agencies to kind of strengthen those partnerships. So, like I said, I'm not going to do like a full summary or anything, but just a couple of things that stood out to me that I wanted to share. First of all, Commissioner Church was our opener and gave a really cool talk about a lot of the great work that's been going on in Southwest Colorado and specifically in Falls Creek Ranch. And that was also what our field trip was. And I heard some really good things about that field trip and how a lot of people across the state have heard about that project as a really good example of collaboration and local efforts around forestry. And people thought it was really cool to actually see it in person. Do you have anything you want to add, Commissioner Church, about your experience or anything that you wanted to share or things that you heard from people while you were there?
Well, I think the conference was excellent. Having a lot of director level people there listening and looking at the impacts. I wish they went on the tour because there's a lot of things that are unique there in this subdivision. But it started out with a mountaintop view of Falls Creek Ranch in the Animas Valley, and then went into the history of mitigation and culture change in Falls Creek and how that was switched from you can't pick up a stick because it's against the covenants to major fire mitigation and forest health actions by the community. And it was very well supported. We get between 2,000 and 3,000 hours of volunteer time per year out of our 100 residents. So that's 100 lots, but only about 40 to 50 full-time homes up there. But anyhow, excellent conference. Put on another one and I'll be there. It's really interesting to meet a lot of people, made some good connections, had fun on the tour. They visited a home that was burned out, first of all, and then rebuilt as a fire hardened home. So very unique things in the construction design and materials there. But other than that, yes, everybody I think was interested. Got great feedback from the tour, so I better be quiet.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much. And yeah, like I said, I wasn't able to attend that, but I also heard pretty good things. Cool. And then we had a couple of sessions that I thought were particularly of note for this group. The main one being that Laura led a small breakout group on the Colorado Forest Resilience Planning Guide. And so I invited her to come today and just share any like feedback that you heard from groups or any new ideas that were sparked, etc.
Yeah, thanks for including me both in the summit and on this call. Hi, everybody. I had, so the World Cafe activity, we had 3 25-minute small group kind of discussion sessions where I socialized the table of contents with a lot of folks who attended, of the planning guide, with a lot of folks who attended my little World Cafe station. My guiding questions were framed around how the planning guide can help collaboratives, how the planning guide can inform programs for program managers, and how within each stage they would approach transitioning stages. The biggest takeaways I think I had were, one, people are very eager to see this planning guide in its development, that it could be really helpful for program design and program management, just providing the framework alone, I think, of how the collaboratives might function at a large scale. People said would be really useful to understand, and just overall make sure that there's an emphasis on balancing implementation with planning. The 2 of the stages in the guide are kind of focused on planning, and 2 of the stages are focused on implementation. So I think it provides that balance, but just a good thing to keep in mind as I'm moving forward with development. Amy or Aaron or Clyde, anyone really, any questions about the small groups?
No, I thought they were real good. One thing that came to my mind later was it would be useful, in addition to the planning guide, to put out an annual list of organizations, HOAs, private landowners that are involved in collaboration and fire mitigation. That would improve the collaboration at the grassroots level. Just, what's the organization, name of the contact, and a phone number or an email, something like that. Just to update it annually, because there are lots of changes going on, and people can contact people.
Yeah, I'm gonna put a link in the chat to the Atlas of Collaborative Conservation in Colorado. It's not perfect, but it is something that our organization, the Center for Collaborative Conservation, tries to keep as updated as possible, at least around the community level groups. So it doesn't include landowners and HOAs, but it does have a pretty good list of the sort of nonprofit type groups. If I can find it, here it is.
Laura, I had a question for you on some of your feedback on the overall sense of eagerness for this, which is great, because I think we spent quite a bit of time as a group just trying to determine if this type of guide would be useful. And I think our hope especially was that it would be useful for entities that don't have the same level of capacity as some of our some areas in the state that have really strongly embraced forest health activities. Mm-hmm. So I was curious if you could share any more of the eagerness of whether you're seeing it from some of those communities that I think we were hoping to target, of people who could really use this guide as a gap for capacity needs. Or if just in any of your conversations, you're seeing some themes of, there seems to be particularly a level of eagerness in X type of community. I'm curious if any themes are rising, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great question, Amy. We just did really simple introductions at the summit during like the World Cafe, of just name and not even organization most of the time. So I'm not totally sure down to kind of the community or area as you're asking, but I think a lot of the signups for the focus groups came from folks like conservation districts, some county commissioner level, and a lot of people on the ground doing work. So I think it would be really interesting to map it out. But Katie, you might have a better understanding of kind of what areas of the state were represented at the summit.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we got pretty diverse interest from across the state, so I'm not sure either who would have been like in that group specifically. If you sent me the list of who ended up showing up to the focus groups, I would probably be able to give a little bit more insight from my knowledge of like kind of where people tend to be located and what the capacity tends to look like in the individual groups that they are representing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And Amy, we can follow up.
Yeah, no worries, Laura. I was just curious and something that I'm interested in hearing more about as the effort moves forward of, who's really interested in using this and how might it be used down the road when it's live and ready. So no need to kind of continue to parse through some of the details. I'm just curious. So thank you.
No problem.
Cool. Laura, I was also curious, I don't know if you were able to tell or not off the top of your head for this either, but I was wondering if you felt like there was a lot of overlap between people who showed up to your breakout groups at Summit versus people who showed up to the focus groups online. Do you feel like the people giving feedback to focus groups were...
There were a handful of familiar faces. I think but across the 3 World Cafe sessions, I probably had I want to say 30 people, maybe 35 show up. And then at the focus groups, we had around 100 people across the 2 of them, I think, sign up or attend. And I would say, I think there was 5 familiar faces. So newer folks that got to hear about it. I did ask how many folks heard about the planning guide or the collaborative stages of kindness amongst at the start of kind of each group. Seemed like a few people in every group were familiar, and a lot of people were unfamiliar with it. So it was new to them. So great to introduce these ideas to new faces. But I wouldn't say a ton of overlap, just some.
Okay. That's super interesting and good to know. I think it's good that you were able to socialize it with more people, but I'm also I wonder why more people hadn't heard of it.
And maybe they had seen it, but not really interacted or dove into what it was. So yeah.
Cool. All right. Another couple that I wanted to highlight, these ones didn't have a ton of notes associated with them, so I will wait till I hear back from speakers to share too much more detail, but I did want to at least throw them out. One was it was another World Cafe session, so similar to Laura's session where we had 3 different rounds of roughly 10 to 20 people per round. But we did one of those on Indigenous collaboration. And my key takeaway from that was there is a ton of interest in this topic from all across the state, all across the board. People seem really interested and excited, but people are just kind of a little shy around wanting to do things right, and they don't quite know where to begin. And so some things that I thought of for this group, I don't remember if it was this group or the legislative committee, but at one point on this council, there was talk about maybe we could make a recommendation to include both of our official tribes in Colorado on the council, because right now there's one tribal seat and there's 2 tribes in Colorado. And then another thing that we talked about a lot in those sessions was like, we only have 2 reservations and 2 kind of officially recognized tribes, but there are tons of like tribal communities that live in more urban areas of the state. And so is there some way that we as like the Colorado Forest Health Council might do a better job of representing that? Or are there resources available that we could kind of help leverage so that people across the state feel a little more comfortable with that? So that was another session that I thought was just kind of interesting. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do. Couldn't get to my mute button. I would think that an invitation letter would be very appropriate to both tribes, to the tribal council or the tribal chair. So we meet quarterly with the Southern Ute Tribal Council and have dinner together.
Mhm.
And so our legal relationship with them is very strong, and be glad to. I don't know. I think just coming from the Forest Health Council would be very appropriate, and let them react, and don't expect a reaction for 6 months or a year, because they have to go through an extensive collaborative process on the reservations.
Mhm.
It is very, very democratic, and decision-making is traditionally slow. So sometimes we've had intergovernmental agreements. Remember, you're dealing with a sovereign nation, not just another tribe. Well, yeah. So anyhow, yes, I think that'd be very appropriate. I think it would be appreciated by the tribes.
Awesome. And Courtney, go ahead. And this was just an idea I came up with off the top of my head. So Courtney could probably give us the behind the scenes on this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I do remember the council talking about perhaps more tribal representation, and I think it's definitely worth exploring, and it would take a legislative action. And certainly the first step is coordinating with Stacy Coleman, DNR's associate director for tribal affairs. I know we maybe moved out of step at some point with the council making a legislative recommendation that included the tribes without consulting them. So I think the next step is just talking with Stacy to see, like, if we were to go down this path, what would the steps be and who are all the appropriate people to talk to first? So I've marked this as an action item to discuss both, to discuss tribal representation on the council. So maybe at the next Leveraging Resources Committee meeting, I can have more information from you all, for you all.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And I don't think that recommendation ever like officially made it forward. I just remember talking about it at some point and people seemed interested, and then yeah, I don't know if it ever went anywhere. So cool. Another session in that World Cafe was on the Colorado Mass Timber Coalition. And this one, again, I don't have any notes on yet, but I did want to bring it up since we've heard from those folks in this committee before. So I didn't even make it to that session, but I did see in the surveys, there were a lot of people saying like, this seems like a need. This seems like something that is really of interest and can be beneficial. So I was glad to know that like this committee has already engaged in that. And maybe as it's moving forward, we can hear from them a little bit more to hear what the updates are and where things are going with that. Cause I think when we heard from Whitney, it was still pretty new. And then the other main session that I wanted to bring up was our leadership session. So the way that this was formatted was we heard kind of super quick 5 minutes or so updates from leadership from DNR, State Forest Service, Colorado Water Conservation Board, NRCS, and then the U.S. Forest Service's State Private and Tribal Forestry Division. So we heard just kind of a couple of quick things that are going on with them. And then we did an activity to generate recommendations from collaboratives up to agency leadership, and also for people who work with agencies, recommendations on how collaboratives can better engage with agencies to make that a stronger partnership. So I wrote down a couple of the top rated recommendations. Courtney, do you want to give an update on your piece first or after I give these couple of recommendations?
Why don't you give the recommendations first? Because I actually can't even remember. I remember
Okay.
2 or 3 of them.
Cool. Yeah. So the way it worked is we, I actually have them right here. We solicited recommendations on all these note cards, and the people were able to rank them. So I just wrote down, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the most highly rated ones. So there are a bunch more that I'll write up a summary of at some point, but I just wanted to give a couple of initial ones to this group. So one was bring agency personnel / leadership into the field to see what efforts can be made for cross coordination. 2, and actually a lot were about this, was some sort of aggravated state and federal fund to help support cross-boundary forestry. Here's another one that's similar, is pool grant programs among agencies to support landscape scale planning through implementation. This would eliminate match requirements because then agencies would already have done it in advance through this pooled program. So that was one that kind of came up worded differently several times. And then create a public database of projects performed by collaboratives, highlighting successes and challenges with visuals, maps, etc. associated with it. And I thought this one was interesting. It was one of the most highly rated, and it sounded like sort of along the lines of what the Forest Tracker could be, is like kind of creating this big database of all these different projects and who's been doing them. It doesn't necessarily highlight successes and challenges, but it does pretty much everything else. And so I thought that might be like kind of a step 1 to this very highly rated recommendation. And then there was one that came up that was from agencies to collaboratives, which was collaboratives should pay people for time and travel to participate. And this could increase representation from people who maybe don't have the time and money to participate. And I didn't know if there's some sort of resource around that that already exists, or if that would just come out of collaborative budgets. But those were some of the top 5 out of about 50 recommendations that we received. And then what we asked the agency leadership to do was to then just kind of give an initial response to those, recognizing that nobody could just make a decision right there on the spot, but we tasked them with at least giving some sort of reaction. And Courtney was our DNR rep for that. Add to that at all?
Yeah, I thought that the activity was really engaging and really interesting, and it was great to see like a crowdsourced list of recommendations. I was in a fun spot, as like not really. Anyway, I was able to acknowledge that I think they're all really great ideas. And because I'm not Dan, I feel like I can be really enthusiastic about that, and he has to be more, just cognizant of what he shares. But I think things that really affect CoSWAP would be like pooling grant programs. And, I don't know if the funding is ever going to combine, but I think having some sort of project review process or application process that's a little more integrated between all the programs could be possible. And there's a lot of wonderful programs that I think can leverage each other, and they could provide match for each other. So that was one I thought was really interesting. And the idea that collaboratives could pay people to participate, that is something that CoSWAP does a little bit, but it's good to hear that that's a big need. And it just makes me wonder if there are funding sources out there that could do more of that. Like, can CoSWAP do more of that? So those were, or like, can capacity funding do more of that? So yeah, I really enjoyed the activity and hearing from people. And I'm very much looking forward to getting the summary of the note cards, because I wrote down like 5 words for each of them. And when I, later the day, I was like, I don't even know what this means. So looking forward to the summary so that I can share them with Dan and Allison and Kelly.
I am curious, Katie, if at a future meeting when we have more of our full group, we can talk again about these ideas of pooling grant funding, or like you said, Courtney, there's some middle of the road steps of if grant programs had a similar due date and review process. Aaron might remember, I think these are some concepts early on in this committee that we were batting around, and it might be a good time to pick that up. And especially with some of the recommendations that came out of this conference, I think it blends nicely with the role of this committee, and could be a nice area to put our heads together and work on a little bit more over the next year.
I'll just mention some other states do that kind of bundling of that stuff. California is one. I think Utah mentioned that they do a little bit of that. Figuring out a way to do that is challenging, but I don't think it's completely out of, I think it's possible. It just requires some investment in the staff to be able to manage a program like that. I think Utah maybe suggested that they had maybe 4 or 5 people just managing how to take all those different funds and put them together. So it's certainly possible, but would need some additional resources.
I think it would take also a little bit of negotiation on the part of grant, criteria and scoring rubrics, because there may be differences between agencies and funding sources. I would be afraid of this becoming the most complex and thorough reporting. I don't know what, I think one of the reviews here would be taking a look at the grant criteria, as well as how they're scored and what information they ask for in reporting. Grant reporting is very, it's a heavy load for a lot of organizations and private landowners. So the easier we can make it, the better participation we'll get. On the other side, we need the data of these projects, and we need to know where money is going. And we have to be responsible to the elected officials, the federal and state. So I think it's possibly doable, but it might take a lot of work.
And we do have, we have some of this model in the Restore program. So Katie, that could be a good, maybe that's a presentation opportunity to see, hear a little bit more about the history and how that program functions and what gaps it's not serving that some of the collaborative recommendations might be asking for. That would either be an expansion of Restore or a separate model, because I agree it's a complex endeavor, but there are some good examples, whether it's in our state or otherwise, and maybe that, depending on if others agree that this would be a topic to explore more, that could be a good presentation start.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we talked a little bit about Restore at Summit. So I have some connections there that we could certainly pull in. And yeah, it also was reminding me a lot of the WRI in Utah that we heard presentation from that was kind of about this. So yeah, maybe exploring that a little bit more. And Aaron, did you have your hand raised or did you put it down?
I would just mention, we manage a lot of federal grants and help in the delivery of those federal grants, whether it's CAFA or Wildland Urban Interface grants, or even the Community Wildfire Defense grants as a part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then, we also have the furworm grants that are state grants. Figuring out how to match those with eligible candidates would require just some stuff. Timing would have to align, right? So we would maybe have to change the state grants to align with when the federal grants would occur. And if we were going to fund state grants with applicants who had received federal grant funding, for example, we may have to change some legislation associated with how we award those furworm or co-swap grants, right? So, I mean, it's all doable, but how to put those pieces together so the timing is right, and how those committees, because right now what happens is you usually get one of those grants and then you go through the process of applying for the second one. And if you have a federal grant, you had to show you had match before you apply for the state grant that might give you that match. And Chafee has done that, right? Where they got that RCPP, and then because they had their own funding to be the match, and then they applied to both co-swap and furworm, and then they didn't have to spend their own funding on that match. So it's another kind of idea on how capacity begets capacity. If you have the match, sometimes you don't have to spend it, but it makes you eligible to combine those things. So it's just one of those challenges we recognize is out there, and how to better align those different grant applications. And maybe it's just as simple as prioritizing for one of those other state grant programs, either furworm or co-swap, the need to apply for those federal grants so that we leverage those state funds as much as we can. But just recognize that when we do those type of things, the big ones are going to be the winners in that. The smaller communities that maybe rely on a small furworm grant, for example, might end up losing out. So there'll be winners and losers with that process, but there are some opportunities to bring that into alignment.
Interesting. Cool. Well, I wrote down a couple notes on some of the initial challenges, ideas, possible examples. So yeah, I think maybe bringing this one up with the larger group to talk about more is a good idea. Anything else on that?
I don't know if this is appropriate, but it might be if there's a way of providing one organization providing the match of volunteer hours or equipment or specialized something. I know our grants are getting easier because we've got equipment and we can use mechanization to do part of the job. And we get a lot of volunteer hours. So even though we have the dollar match, we'd end up not using the whole dollar match because we can put in 300 or 1,000 or 5,000 hours of volunteer time. So there's ways of doing that, but it's not all uniform across different granting and funding agencies.
Yeah, I think getting creative is always necessary for those. Awesome. So just the last couple of notes that I had, these were just kind of random things that came up that I thought might be of interest to this group. They are all people that I met that I thought might be interesting to bring on. One of them who I met is Laurel Smirch. She's the new coordinator of natural resources at Pueblo Community College. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I believe this is the workforce program that the Forest Health Council really supported in the creation of. And so I was very excited to see that they've officially hired someone, and I didn't know if there was some way that we wanted to kind of circle back to that and see if there's ways that we can continue to support, or if there are needs or resources Aaron, go ahead.
I'll just mention that we've been working really closely with them and Front Range Community College in Fort Collins, which are the two programs that really are making the most success out of some of those workforce development issues. But that workforce development with free community college for forestry, wildland fire programming is gonna sunset, I think at the end of 2025. So I think maybe just having that on our radar of when that we may need to think about whether or not there's funding and a political desire to continue that going. If there was more interest in some of that stuff, there are other community colleges across the state that have expressed interest in moving forward with some of those programs. I know I'm an academic advisor to the program at Front Range, and they also hired up and are expanding their program, but they're kind of wondering, there's more applicants than they have room for in their program. So they could expand more with some security that it would be continued past 2025, I think.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that update. I hadn't heard most of that. And Clyde, did you have something to add on?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention or ask if the Department of Labor is putting any funding in the pot to help make this work, or maybe even expand it. I mean, this is workforce training, and I mean, I've pushed it. I'm on the Rural Consortium Workforce Board, and they should be putting some money in it, personal opinion. So I can't do I don't have much influence, but it just seems like the right thing and the right place to be collaborating with them.
Aaron, do you know about that at all, if they're involved or if that's a path to take?
I'm not 100% certain. Obviously, there was state funding that went into that program that's covering the cost for those students to attend those specific community college classes, and they filled up really quickly. But I don't know exactly where the funding was coming from or which departments were involved. I'm looking for the bill number that provided that. I'll find it here in just a second.
Cool.
I'll poke around the Rural Consortium a little bit and see what I find.
Okay, so this maybe is another one to bring to the broader group and just see if, like, as it's approaching its sunset, if maybe this is something that we want to talk more about. You're muted.
Sorry. Would an extension of the funding, the legislation funding, be appropriate at this time? Or is that ARPA dollars and the dollars are gone now? That's what it was?
I think it happened during a time when there was stimulus dollars available. And funding was not such an issue. I don't know if the funds that paid for it were specifically ARPA or not, but it was certainly during that time when there was a lot more resources to allocate. So I'll find it here in just a second. I'm still looking.
That makes sense. Does anyone else have questions, thoughts around this at all?
Well, just out of curiosity, when the students apply for the program, for the forestry program at these institutions, do they pay partial tuition, or do they, is it a free ride or a scholarship, or what mechanism was provided in the legislation, or was there any? Maybe just rulemaking.
The classes that are associated with that programming got refunded to the students. So the students at Front Range who signed up for those forestry classes and those wildfire classes, at least last spring or last fall, just got reimbursed for the credits associated with that programming. So if they were taking an English 101 class or a psychology 101 class or something like that, that funding for those credits didn't get put back into their account. But the forestry classes, they got those students who were pursuing that degree path program at Front Range got reimbursed for their tuition.
Oh, I didn't know that. So I thought that the workforce bill like created new programming and new classes and stuff. Is that also the case? And will those positions die when it sunsets, or like will that at least keep going, but now the students will just have to pay for it? Or we don't know.
There were two different programs. One was to create an internship program with separate legislation, and one was to provide that low cost, no cost tuition for some of those selected fields. And there was like adjoining legislation that did it for teachers and for nurses and a couple of other programs. But yeah.
Okay, so maybe a little more research into this and kind of what happened, what's going on, what opportunities might be in the future. But that was just one person that I saw pop up on the registration list that I was pretty excited to see. Another one, and Courtney, you might be able to fill in my gaps on this, but I don't know how to say his name either, but it's Adam Auerbach, I think. And he is working on a research project developing technical assistance and peer learning components of the NFF Collaborative Capacity Program. And so he's been like interviewing people, and bye Amy, thanks for coming. He's been trying to get an understanding of landscape of existing resources, identifying gaps, and then targeting efforts to support practitioners. And so Courtney and I briefly chatted at breakfast one morning around like, could we bring him on to kind of hear like what trends he's seeing, what they're thinking, and where what resources we might know of for him, and then what gaps he might have identified for us. So I thought that was interesting. And Courtney, fill in if I'm not explaining that well.
I think you explained it well. I think it would be really wonderful to hear from him, because one of like the few things I heard him say is that people don't think like a catalog or a library of static resources is the number one thing they need. But it could be potentially more like engaging or dynamic or like one-on-one sort of recommendations. So I just think hearing from him on what he's really hearing from people on the ground would be helpful.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just, I'm not sure there's a gap here, but between organizations like the Southwest Conservation Corps, which is a hands-on type of an organization, versus the academic training and education we're doing, which I think we need both. Is there a gap there to bridge that, to get the academics the hands-on experience? You know, how do you sharpen a chainsaw? Even basics like that. Some people put the chain on backwards and wonder why it's so dull. Doesn't cut at all. So, I mean, is there a gap, and do we want to address that?
That's an interesting idea. It kind of reminds me of the recommendation on the note cards as well, around like getting people out in the field who have like decision-making power and kind of helping them understand like what are the on the ground challenges. Is that kind of what you're getting at, but more on the academic side?
Well, in the training, is there a continuum that exists now, or is there a gap between a bachelor's and a conservation corps certificate that can be turned in for adult education classes? I mean, that's kind of where the conservation corps people are. They're trying to get people into the workforce, trained so they can get a summer job as a sawyer or a firefighter. That's bottom up versus the top down. We're working with the university. I don't know what those curriculums are like.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Go ahead, Aaron.
There's definitely two paths. One path would prepare you to work with one of the contractors, the industry. They've got, tabletop and full simulators that teach you how to operate some of the heavy equipment, but also teach you chainsaws and tree identification and some of the basics. So there's that. And then there's the path that might take you to CSU and Warner College to get a forestry degree. And so we're working with our internship program. We actually supported 2 interns to work with us this summer from Front Range in our internship program, and are reaching out to Pueblo and hoping to maybe support some of them out of our Durango field office. And we're even looking at supporting some interns with that other university in Durango, out of our Durango office. So I think those are some of the, so that's, I couldn't think of it for some reason. I've been in Durango so many times, so we're working on both of those things, but 2 paths. One, really supporting the development of knowledgeable professionals to go into some of that industry. And I will tell you that some of those jobs, like I'm pointing a cousin to those jobs, because you can get just a little bit of free college education and then walk into a job that pays pretty well and has a definite future in it. So different paths for different people, but yeah. And I put some of that stuff in chat for Front Range, and that House Bill 23-1246. And I have a PDF of that signed legislation. I don't know if I can, I'm seeing if I can put that in there. And if not, I can send it. Maybe. Yeah, I'll have to figure out a different path to get it sent. I could send it to Courtney or Katie. But just, or you can go, I bet if I look for the website, I can find it too, where I downloaded the PDF.
Yeah, I think if you type in the bill number, it usually comes up.
It'll pop up.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. The last kind of connection that I wanted to share in our last couple minutes is, I don't know if people have heard about the Coalitions and Collaboratives Revolving Loan Fund, but this is bridge funding to help collaboratives who either can't or really have trouble with reimbursement style grants. And this is like just a very low interest loan that people would be able to take and then pay out of that and then get reimbursed later. So that's something she had just kind of approached me and said that they are really trying to figure out what's the best way to employ that. And I don't know if there's a space for us there, but I wanted to throw that out there because I do think that it has a lot to do with some of the grant related challenges that we talk about a lot in this group.
Just thinking, what popped in my mind here is it may be, the organization, Region 9 Economic Development or Region 10 Economic Development, the office of OED is really set up for handling the finances. That may be a partner. I don't know if it's cast in concrete from the legislation or not.
At least the program that Katie was talking about that COCO is doing is really exciting, because there's a lot of collaboratives out there who they need to front the money before they can file the paperwork to get reimbursed. And sometimes they're taking very high interest loans to be able to pay off a contractor so that they can show a payment to get reimbursed from a state agency. So it's really low risk because they have an awarded grant. They've got money coming either from the feds or from the state, and they know the money's coming, but they need to pay that money first. This would allow a 3% interest rate where some of the collaboratives are putting it on credit cards at like 24%, or they're going through a bank to get these loans. And some of those loans, I think, were even more than 30%, believe it or not. And it's a short turnaround, right? Where in like less than 3 months, they're going to get reimbursed, but they need to pay the contractor to put in the paperwork to get reimbursed. These 3% loans, I think, barely cover the cost of managing the program, but it's something that would build on itself in the future too. So it's an exciting thing that COCO's doing. Full support from us on the idea, because it's definitely solving one of those wicked problems that especially smaller collaboratives have in getting into the market, is they have to be able to front the money. We find homeowners associations in this situation where they get a $200,000 grant and they're like, we don't have $200,000. So they can't reimburse, they wait for reimbursement. So it's definitely a challenge. We're excited about this initiative. It's a good one.
I think that's fantastic. As we may have to be a little more patient with the money. Because I've heard of some reimbursements taking, 8 to 12 months, but that's very rare. So.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's kind of what this is meant to help, is that if it does take a while, it's not, harming the small nonprofit collaborative group. Yeah, so I know there's a lot of excitement around this. I'm not sure if or what the role of this committee would be in that, but I wanted to throw that out there as another just kind of idea that can exist in this group. And that is all that I had written down. I'm sure that there will be more ideas coming from Summit. I'll be writing a little report, and yeah, definitely I'll send that out to people in this group. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Courtney, I'm not going to bring anything up from this group to the Southern Utes, but just in case you want to, from a political standpoint, our next dinner with the Southern Ute Tribal Council is Monday, September 30th for our quarterly meeting. So please give me a heads up on how to handle this if you want to. Otherwise, I won't say anything.
Yeah. Thank you, Clyde. I would say, don't say anything. Anything from the council will need to move through the Department of Natural Resources. But I will let Stacy know that you also have that connection. So if there needs to be a council member who makes some sort of outreach, you could be a great person for that. So I'll let her know. Thank you.
Yeah, we do have, there is somebody out there, whether they want to participate in this group or not, or in the Forest Health Council. I think it would be good, but there's outside forces here. So thank you very much. Let me know.
Cool. Yeah, it seems like September 30th might be a little too soon just because we won't have time to talk to the rest of the council. But yeah, we'll all kind of keep in touch around that. And at some point, maybe we can move forward with something like that. Anything else before we go ahead and adjourn? All right, seeing none, I don't think we need a motion or anything since we don't have quorum. So I guess with that, I'll just say thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you next month. Bye.